Well, it's now 6 o'clock. I know we're still going to have people joining us, for the first couple minutes and throughout the presentation. But I think, we want to be mindful of everyone's time. We do have a lot of material to go through since this is the density workshop. So I'll go ahead and kick us off and get us started, just so you all know. And we'll just start quickly with some introductions so you know who from the city and who from our team is on the line. For those who don't know me, my name is Louisa Leite, and I'm a project manager with Dover Cole & Partners, also a town planner and urban designer. And I've been working on the vision plan now for just about a year. So Victor, if you want to say hello as well.
Good evening, everyone. I'm Victor Dover, town planner, urban designer, working alongside Louisa. Tonight's really important because we have a lot of educational material in addition to some questions for you. It is not an ending, it is a beginning of conversations about a key component, not the only thing that matters, but a key component in your comprehensive plan and land development regulations, and that is density. So after tonight, for example, you'll be able to ask your friends questions when they say, I like the density or I don't like the density. You'll be able to say, what do you mean, the gross density or the net density? And so forth. And so Louisa's going to explain some of these concepts and then also compare them to real places, many of which you will recognize. We'll also get your feedback on some key questions. We have not proposed any density ideas as of yet in the comprehensive plan or land development regulations. We do not have a draft. This is the conversation where we start the topic off. We know it's a hard topic. That conversation will continue in the sessions that follow, but this is a good place to start. And with that, thank you for being here for all of us.
Thanks, Victor. We also have Brenda Diaz and Bill Stokowski from our team, and Lisa Nissenson as well. If you just want to say a quick hello, Brenda, just so everyone can see you.
Hi.
Brenda she'll be helping us run all the poll questions that we'll be asking and helping present some of the slides as well.
Yeah,
I'm Bill Spakowski with Spakowski Planning, and I'm helping Dover Cole & Partners on the Code and Comprehensive Plan Amendments, something that we do together all over the state.
All right, we also have some councilmen who have joined us so far, as well as city staff. We have Christina Wright and Stephen Wynn from the city joining us, as well as Councilmember Messenger and Councilmember Chin. If you all want to say hello, you can feel free to unmute yourself, and then we'll go ahead and get started.
Good evening, this is Councilman Chin. I think I also see our new Councilwoman Lauren Key in your attendee list.
Oh, here, I see her. Let me promote her. There we go. Great, thank you. Great. All right, so we'll go ahead and get started. Like Victor said, this is a big topic, and we know everyone feels very passionately about that. That's not, unique to Neptune Beach. Density is always something people are really sensitive to, and we do understand that. So we wanted to give this meeting, its due place throughout this process. So this meeting is being recorded, and it'll be available for anyone who wasn't able to make it. Feel free to let them know that they can find this recording online tomorrow. It'll be on the website along with a list of all the other events we have coming up. So please share this with anyone who couldn't make it. Also, this is set up as a webinar. We really encourage you to ask questions. We're sure that you will have them, and we've actually structured this meeting to have several moments to do some Q&A. It's a very, important topic, but it's also a little bit of a wonky planner topic, and there is some math involved, big disclaimer. Math always is a component of how we understand and calculate density in different communities. So for those who don't like math, I apologize ahead of time. But we definitely want to hear and answer as many questions as we can. So I'll just quickly overview the process and timeline for phases 2 and 3 of our work in Neptune Beach. We'll do a quick pop quiz. We won't see who's answering what, so don't worry, there won't be any grades. Then we'll go into some specific topics about residential density. We'll look at lots of examples so you can see what these numbers actually mean in the built environment. And we'll look specifically then at Neptune Beach's own permitted and actual densities, and then we'll do some polling and Q&A at the end. So this is the second of our winter workshops. Last week we had an introduction to comprehensive plans and land development regulations. Our goal in setting up all these different meetings is to try and break down these kind of complicated policy and regulatory questions into more manageable meetings, and also give more people a chance to participate since we're having a lot more shorter meetings. This will be the longest meeting because we felt it really deserved to be the longest. It's an important topic. So in January, we'll continue our series of workshops as well, and you can find all information about this on the NeptuneBeachVisionPlan.com website. And this is the actual events page of our website. Here you can see a list of all the meetings, and you'll also see the links to all the recorded meetings after they've occurred. Like I mentioned, this is phases 2 and 3 of a 3-phase process. We began with the community vision plan, which is just now wrapping up, but we're also starting up our work on the comprehensive plan and updating the zoning code and land development regulations. 2 phases which will be happening concurrently. So I don't expect you to read all of this, but just to reiterate that we're just getting started with phases 2 and 3. And the first step is having these winter meetings and workshops to do a little bit of education about what these different things mean. That's why we had the introduction to the comp plans and land development regulations last week, and are doing this series of meetings to try and help make this a little bit easier to understand and get your opinions along the way as well. But we'll be shooting to have an updated comprehensive plan draft sometime in early summer, as well as the draft updates to any land development regulations, as well as more in late summer and fall. Okay, so with that, welcome to your Density 101. We're going to start with a live poll. This is what we do at every single meeting, just to see who has joined us. And with that, I'll have Brenda start that poll. For those who weren't in our meeting last week, you can all take out your cell phones. This is a new polling tool we're using. So if you're at home watching with several people, every single person can participate individually in the poll. You just use your cell phone, and you can type or send a message to the number 22333, and you send the message Dover Cole 516, DOVERKOHL 516. Once you do that, you will actually be in the poll, and that'll keep you in the poll for the remainder of the meeting. So we'll be asking questions throughout the meeting, so you can just keep that text message thread open, and that's how you'll actually answer the question. So this will be our trial run, if you will.
So the first question is, have you participated in previous community vision plan events? So you can answer A for yes or B for no, this is my first event. Wow, it looks like a lot of people have joined us before. Thank you, welcome back. And we have some newcomers as well.
Great.
All right. I'm gonna lock this one and then we'll move on to the next one. So the next one is, where do you live? So you can answer east of 3rd Street, west of Penman Road, between Penman and 3rd Street, other beaches community, greater Jacksonville area, or outside of Jacksonville. And I see we have some people. Okay, so the instructions are at the very top of the screen. So it'll be repeated throughout the polling. So if you want to send a message to the number 22333, and the message you're sending is Dover Cole 516. Once you're inside the poll, you'll be able to answer with just sending the letter. All right, I'm gonna lock this one and move on to the next one. And our last one for right now is, what is your age? Oh, we have some young people. Welcome. A really good range of different, age groups.
I think our one teenager or preteen deserves a round of applause for dedicating their Tuesday night to be with us.
Mm-hmm. Great, awesome. And then
all right. So that was our trial run with the poll, but also a chance for us to know who's joined us tonight. And we know we'll have other people joining us throughout the meeting. You know, it's hard sometimes to get on right at 6 o'clock. But so just a quick definition. So what is density? Well, we typically think of density in two ways. The first is population density, which is the number of residents per square mile. And the second is residential density, which means the number of homes per acre. And residential density is really what we're mostly concerned with when it comes to the comprehensive plan and the land development regulations and zoning code for a city. And there are two kind of subtypes of residential density definitions. And this is very important, as you'll see throughout the rest of the presentation, and it'll come up again and again. So definitely let us know if you have questions. But there's gross residential density, and that means the homes, number of homes per gross acre. And gross acreage includes the building site, plus the streets, any public rights of way, and common amenity areas that serve those residents. And then there's net residential density, and that's the number of homes per acre, but that's per net acre. And when we say net acreage, we mean just the building site itself. So gross versus net changes the denominator of our equation, right? So if it's gross density, you're dividing by larger acreage that includes more things. But when you're looking at net density, you're dividing by net acreage, which is a smaller area, only the actual building site. All right, so with that, we get to do our pop quiz. And like I mentioned, nothing will be graded. This is just kind of a nice icebreaker where we're gonna ask you all to guess which density is higher. So again, if you participated in the last poll, you can open up that same text thread that you had. If not, if you're just joining us, you can text Dover Cole 516 to the number 22333, and that will allow you to join our poll. Then each time you see a question, all you have to do is text the number that corresponds with the answer.
So the first question is, which neighborhood is denser? A for historic Charleston, or B for Beverly Hills?
And I'll note that the first couple of questions are looking at population density. That's just a kind of easier number to wrap our head around when we're looking at this scale of a place. So we tried to get, you know, neighborhoods that are roughly the same size to compare. So you can go ahead and open up the actual poll, Brenda.
Mm-hmm.
So the question is, which neighborhood is denser, historic Charleston or Beverly Hills, California? Historic Charleston is about 2.3 square miles, and Beverly Hills is about 2.9 square miles.
Okay, I'm going to go ahead and lock it. Okay, a couple more people answering. All right, I'm going to lock it and then we'll show the answer. So Beverly Hills, California has more residents per square mile.
Yeah, so I'll say that I was probably just as surprised as you were when I was doing this analysis. And I guess there's several reasons why this could be, why Beverly Hills might have a higher population density, or residential population density. And these are the kinds of things we want you all to start thinking about. So historic Charleston is a much more mixed use area. So there's a lot of people living in these buildings, but there's also a lot of retail, there's a lot of hotels, there's a lot of commercial and office areas as well, and they're all kind of mixed together. Beverly Hills is a much more residential area, so much more limited amount of commercial and mixed use. It could also be, for example, that there are more people, or larger homes with more people in them. So perhaps in Beverly Hills, there are 3 people on average per household, whereas in Charleston, it's more like 1.5. So there's lots of variables that go into these calculations and result in these numbers. But yeah, interesting that a place we traditionally think as very low density and primarily drive to would have a higher population density than a compact and walkable historic neighborhood. All right, next question.
Second question. So this is comparing A for Washington, D.C. downtown, or B, Chicago downtown loop. All right, so I'm going to open a poll. So once again, A for Washington, D.C. downtown, or B for the Chicago downtown loop.
Interesting.
Okay, I'm going to lock it now and show you the answer. They're the same.
Yes, so these actually have almost identical population densities. And as I think some of you probably have already caught on, one of the reasons for that is that downtown Chicago, or the downtown loop area, has a very high amount of office space, which would not count to its population density. It also has really large public spaces and wide highways and very wide streets running through it in transit, and all of those also factor into the calculation. Mm-hmm. Whereas DC is much more compact.
Right. And the last one of this version of question is we're comparing A, Beacon Hill, North End, Boston, or B, Chelsea, London. Which one is more dense? And I'm going to show you the poll now. Oh, 50-50, about 50-50.
Interesting.
Yeah. Okay, I'm gonna lock it now. And the answer is A, Beacon Hill, North End, Boston.
All right. So I'm not surprised to see that it was almost 50-50. If anyone has ever been to either of these neighborhoods, they actually feel almost identical in their scale. They have a lot of walk-up apartments and townhouses, but also some really nice parks and public spaces. So I expected them to be a little bit closer. But, unlike the last example where you saw 2 very different types of neighborhoods that had essentially the exact same population density, here you have the opposite of that. So you have 2 neighborhoods that feel and look quite similar, but one actually ends up being a lot denser than the other. And that again could be the average size of the units or number of units per building. It could be the average number of people per household, and a number of other things.
So we're going to ask you a different type of question now. Which building or development is denser? And so this is just looking at the image itself. Which one do you think is more dense?
So now we're looking at residential density as opposed to population density, like in the last 3 questions. And I'll say that these both are showing duplexes, So the top image is a stacked duplex. It's one on top of the other. And the bottom image is a side-by-side duplex. So I'll admit this is a really difficult one to know the answer to.
Well, it's also interesting that in this example, building A has a deeper front setback and wider side setbacks between the building and the property line as compared to building B, which has a shallower front setback and shallower side setbacks.
And the answer is A.
Right. So even though they're the exact same building type, they're both duplexes on a single lot. Building A has, substantially higher residential density, and that's measured as dwelling units or homes per acre. That's the DU per acre that you see. Then building B, and that's just a direct reflection of the actual size of the underlying lot. So building A was built on a smaller lot than building B. And that one difference, that one change in variable can have a dramatic impact on what the actual residential density is.
So this is the second question. Which one do you think is more dense? Once the answers stop coming in, I'll go ahead and lock it and show you the answer. All right. And they're the same, about the same.
All right, so you all were close. It was almost a 50-50 split. These are the same. So on the left, you have a mixed-use multifamily that's actually in Rosemary Beach, Florida. And then on the right-hand side, those are some small lot homes in Mount Pleasant, South Carolina. And they are both 33 dwelling units per acre.
And the last one is which building, again, development is more dense? These look very different. So A or B. Looks like a lot of people are saying B. Okay. Yeah, it's B.
This is not a trick question. You all got it right for the most part. So B has a higher density than A. A is showing a pocket neighborhood, and B is showing Tapestry Park, which y'all may be familiar with. It's mixed-use development in Jacksonville. I think what's notable, though, is that the development in B is actually not that much higher than the pocket neighborhood shown on the left. And again, there's lots of reasons for that. Like we mentioned, B is actually a mixed-use development. So not everything you see is actually residential. There's also office, retail, commercial. And there's a lot of public spaces and streets. We're showing gross density here as opposed to net. So that actually includes all the streets and public spaces that are within the development. So development B has a lot more of that than A.
Also want to remind you before you start your presentation, Louisa, everyone, please use the Q&A button to send questions to the team. If you have any questions or any thoughts come up as you see the presentation, feel free to go ahead and send those to the team. Bill, Victor, and I will start answering them so that we can answer as many questions as we can tonight.
All right, great. Yeah, we'll have lots of opportunities throughout the presentation to actually answer questions. It won't just be at the end. So definitely, if you have a question as you see something, feel free to hit the Q&A button and submit that question. All right, well, that was the end of the pop quiz. So now we're gonna explain a little bit more what residential density is and how it's measured and some of the nuances of it. So hopefully what you came to understand as you went through the exercise is that, and something we constantly remind ourselves is that residential density is a really important tool when it comes to growth management, but it can be misleading as a community design tool. And so when I say growth management, I mean how the state and how the region and the county and the city actually ensures that the necessary public infrastructure and public services are in place to accommodate any expected growth in population. And so that's really the whole purpose behind comprehensive planning overall, is to make sure that any projected growth, any changes in your land development patterns are being properly accommodated by infrastructure and public services. But when it comes to community design, the way your neighborhood looks, the way it feels, density can be misleading. Places that look and feel the same can have very different densities. Building types that are identical in every other way can have very different densities just because of either how many units there are inside, how big each unit is, how big the underlying lot is. So here's a simple graphic that helps to demonstrate how you can accommodate the same number of units in very different configurations. So each of these three diagrams has the same density, 30 units to the acre. And these squares that you see are about 2 by 2 acres, roughly. And so you can have what we call towers in the park that are 30 units to the acre, or you can have a series of row houses or townhouse streets, or you could have something in between with some low-rise multifamily, and they will all give you the same exact density. And as I've mentioned already, there's a lot of variables that can affect how useful a density figure is. One of them, like we've seen already, is the land area. What is the denominator in our equation? Is it gross? Is it net? If one lot is just a tiny bit smaller than the one next to it, that already can have a large effect on the actual measured density, net density of that individual property. The number of units in a project will greatly affect what the density is. And similarly, the size of each of those units will affect that as well. Things like ceiling heights, the mix of uses, as we've already discussed, if there's some office in commercial or a hotel versus just residential, that will also affect the overall density. And the number of spaces that are required, the parking requirements. So I want to demonstrate the difference between gross and net residential density in a real world example. This is a townhouse development in Delray, and it takes up roughly one entire city block, typical city block. And so if we want to measure the gross density of this property, we would take the entire area of this entire project, which is an aggregation of what used to be several smaller lots. And the total area is 4.5 acres. And the number of homes in this development is 83. So if we divide those, we get a gross density of 18 dwelling units to the acre. But if we want to get the net residential density, then we have to look at the actual building areas. So what we're excluding are the streets, the parking, and any amenity areas, like I mentioned before. And so the actual average lot size here is about 0.03 acres. So your net density is much closer to 33 dwelling units per acre. So you can see the big difference you can have when it comes, if you're comparing gross density, which is 18 in this case, to net density, which is 33. And again, this will be important, and it'll come back at several different points in this presentation. So why do we have two different kinds? Well, gross density is really useful in trying to plan for large growth areas or large redevelopment sites that are the aggregation of what used to be several smaller lots or just previously undeveloped land. And the reason that's easier is because these larger redevelopments tend to include blocks and new streets and new parking areas and new parks. And so it's easier to think of them in the aggregate, the entire new development, and then the number of homes you're permitting, in addition to all these other uses. But if you're an individual property owner, or you're someone looking to build on just one lot, say like an infill development site, net density is a lot more useful because it tells you exactly how much residential and how many units you can put on your individual lot, which doesn't include any streets or large public amenity areas or parks and things like that. So the other variable that can greatly change the actual measured density is unit size. So these are two of the exact same buildings, the same floor plate on the same exact site. This is a 1.3 acre site. It's a 4-story building, but the building on the left has a mix of 1, 2, and 3 bedrooms. And the building on the right has only 1-bedroom apartments. So because the unit sizes are smaller in the building on the right, it has a significantly higher residential density than the building on the left. So a lot of times what we say with density is if you're trying to get some smaller, more affordable units, you have to be careful what your density maximum is, because that could inadvertently create a situation where developers are going to provide a lot more bigger units because they can't surpass that density threshold. It's not necessarily something we would see in Neptune Beach, but just so you all understand the concept. All right, so that's just a brief overview of what residential density is and how we think about gross versus net. I wanted to give an opportunity to anyone who had any questions on anything we've presented so far to see if we could answer some of those now. And I know our team has already been answering a couple of them.
So we have one question. Do you include wetlands in gross or net density?
Wetlands would not be included in net density. And correct me if I'm wrong, Bill, but I believe like a conservation easement area would be included in gross. That's correct, right?
Yeah, generally in gross density, but never in net density. So you're correct.
Right. Yeah. All right. And I see we had some questions that are already answered. I want to see if there's any that we should repeat. So the point of these exercises is just to explain what the concept of density is from a planning perspective. Like we mentioned, we're in phases 2 and 3, and we have to set the residential densities for the town and update the land development regulations. And density is something that is an actual number that is put in your comprehensive plan, and it's also put in your land development regulations. So, like I said, it can be a tricky concept, and we wanted to have this opportunity to, talk about it and show some examples of it.
So Louisa, one theme through some of the various posts and questions is, are we going through this explanation, or are we looking at these pictures in some attempt to sell a particular answer, a density that's different from that which is presently permitted, or a high density, however you measure high or higher than high or higher than that, whatever that means. There is no such a thing going on here. We are simply educating on how the concept works, what the difference between gross and net density are, because you will have to decide numbers that go into the comprehensive plan. And that's a required component of state mandated comprehensive plans. You have to answer this parameter. Your community is undergoing a major update, to confirm what numbers should be in that document. So you have to have a calm community conversation about that. And we're simply doing this to equip you to have it. But no one on your consultant team or the city staff is pushing you on a certain answer with any of this. All we are doing is giving you the tools to have a good conversation about it, about where you want it to end up. And remember, the decision about what's in your comprehensive plan and land development regulations in the end does not lie with your city manager or your planning director or your consultants. It lies in the hands of your city council members, the elected officials, who are not going to do anything to those numbers without a complete and thorough public process, of which this is one component. It's really an extra component. It's not a required hearing. We're doing this in order to help you have a more productive use of that time. So that's what this is. And I'd be happy to answer more questions about that.
Yeah, exactly. And density is a term that gets thrown out very loosely all the time, and we understand that. But it is also a legal term that has to be defined in a city's regulations. And so it's important to make that distinction. And so we're really here to answer any questions you have about that and explain density as it pertains to community planning. So, all right, so with that, we'll go into our next section. Now we're going to be talking about densities and what that actually means for different types of buildings. So of course, there's a wide spectrum of different building types. And again, not to say that these are the ones that are all appropriate in Neptune Beach. Neptune Beach is certainly on the lower spectrum, probably only the first quarter of the images you see if you're going from left to right. But just so you start to understand that these numbers, roughly correspond to different types of development and different types of buildings. So your single family residential typically falls under the 12 dwelling units per acre net. Now there's always some exceptions depending on how small the actual lot is. Then your duplexes and triplexes, courtyard apartments, bungalow courts, those tend to fall in the 12 to 30 dwelling unit per acre category, and so on and so forth. And just so you have an idea, your mid-rise developments, of which there are none and will never be any in Neptune Beach, they can start at 40, but those can go all the way up to 90 dwelling units per acre easily. And when you talk about high-rise development, that's in the hundreds, just to give you a sense of the differences between the different scales of development. And so we wanted to look at some real-world examples instead of just drawings to give you a sense. Like I just mentioned, there can be single-family homes that surpass the 12 dwelling unit per acre threshold that I mentioned. This is a historic house in Key West, Florida. It's one detached single-family home, and it's 17 dwelling units to the acre net. So that's just the one home divided by the 0.06 acres, and it's a one-story home. To show you an example of a bungalow court, this is something we shared during a concept we shared during our neighborhood workshops of, gathering detached single-family homes around a shared central space as opposed to a long street. So this is an example in Washington. It's 0.7 acres. It's new construction, and it shows 8 detached cottages. So if you look at the gross acreage, which includes the public spaces and the side access lane and parking, it's about 11 dwelling units to the acre. But if you take just the building lots, it's about 20 dwelling units per acre net. And the bungalows can range from 1 to 2 stories in height. So another building type is a compact villa. So these are also detached single-family homes. And this is an example in Earl's, it's called Earl's Court from Mount Pleasant, South Carolina, just by Charleston. So this project in particular is a group of 26 compact villas, 24. And so the gross density is 26 dwelling units per acre. But if we remove the streets and all the common areas, the net density is 33 dwelling units per acre. And these homes range from 2 and 3 stories in height. And again, this is just so you can actually start to understand what the numbers mean in a real built environment. So this is that duplex that we've already shown. This is in Cape Charles, Virginia. It's a historic example. It's 2 homes on 0.12 acres. So it's 17 dwelling units per acre. Here's an example of a fourplex or a quadplex, 4 units. And this is another historic example. It's in Miami Beach. And this one is 22 dwelling units to the acre. And it's a 2-story building. here's an example of a courtyard building type. So it's 4 semi-attached houses, and they're all facing onto a shared courtyard space. This one is also 22 dwelling units to the acre and 2 stories. And so when we go into townhouse, so now we're, not talking about necessarily detached or semi-detached. These are fully attached. This is a fully attached type. And again, the densities can range. This particular example is 18 dwelling units per acre gross, because this is a larger development, but the actual net density of each of these units is 33. And so you'll see we're kind of going up in scale of different building types. So you can see how the actual density numbers change as the different types of development change as well. Sometimes the numbers don't actually go up, even though visually it feels that the scale is going up. So these are the Casa Laguna apartments in Los Angeles. And this one is also a historic example. It's 18 apartments, and that's 36 dwelling units per acre net. So now here's a larger example of that. And again, we're not suggesting this for Neptune Beach. We just are trying to give you as many different examples to illustrate the concept of density and how it relates to different types of development. This one is 33 dwelling units per acre. It has 33 apartments, 2 to 3 stories in height. And now we're going to look at some mixed use examples. So up until now, everything I've showed you is only residential. But what happens when we start adding different uses in the same building? So these are what we call live-work units, where you might have a shop or a small professional office on the ground floor, and then an apartment above it. So these are in Habersham in Beaufort, South Carolina. And so each unit is just one apartment over, or condo over a shop, or ground floor retail and office. And these are 20 dwelling units to the acre net. So these often have slightly lower densities than you might see in a typical town, in some other developments of similar scale, because some of the space is being utilized for ground floor retail and office. So here's a step up from that. So this is small scale mixed use. So it's not just one apartment over a shop. So this is a historic example in Charleston. The last example is new construction, actually. So these are 2 apartments over ground floor retail, and that's 33 dwelling units to the acre. Here's an example in Rosemary Beach. These are the lofts at Barrett Square. So this one has 14 condo units above some retail shops. And you can see how the density went up in this case. It's 46 dwelling units per acre. Here's a more medium scale, and by that we just mean it accommodates more units. This is a 2-story example in Fort Myers. These are the historic Earnhardt condominiums in the Earnhardt Historic Building. So only the second floor is residential and the ground floor is retail. It's 25 condo units, and that's 42 dwelling units per acre. And finally, the last one, also medium scale. This is just under 30 apartments, 29 apartments in Santa Barbara. And this one is 3 stories. That's 26 dwelling units per acre. It's actually less than the prior example, even though the scale of the building is much larger. And that's a result of the size of the units and how they're actually configured. Okay. So are there any questions about the different examples, or how some building types tend to fall within a range of density categories, or anything about what we just showed that we should try and answer now? I will say that the next topic of conversation will be specifically about Neptune Beach. For now, we've just been showing examples to help understand the concept. But the next set of slides and the next time will be dedicated specifically to what density is in Neptune Beach. So let's see. We have one question that is, are we saying that apartments and condos have the same density as residential housing? Well, what we're saying is that it depends. The density number has several variables that impact what it actually is. So there are some condos that might actually have a very similar density to a single family house if that single family house is on a very small lot and the condo has only a few units and maybe is on a much larger lot. Typically, single family detached residential has lower densities, as we showed on that first slide, where you saw the different range of building types and how the density tends to increase. But of course, I think everything that would be considered missing middle housing, duplexes, townhouses, triplexes, bungalow courts, they all tend to fall, and small lot residential sometimes as well, tend to fall within a, let's say, 15 to 30 dwelling units per acre range. And we say range because, like we've said, you can't associate one single density number with a building type because there are so many variables that affect it. But that's a typical range when we're talking about smaller scale development. And single family is typically under 12 dwelling units per acre. But again, there are some single family homes on very, very small lots, including some in Neptune Beach, that can be higher than that number.
Louisa, we have one question here that might be a segue for the next part of the presentation is, are the density values in our current code gross or net?
Sorry, can you repeat that?
Are the density values in our current code gross or net?
In the photos? Oh,
In the current.
Okay, so we'll cover that in the next section. The current codes are measured in gross. And so we'll talk about that too in this next section and explain that difference. Let's see. All right, so I think my next section is going to answer a lot of these questions. So yeah, the current code is measured in gross density. Okay. All right, so now we get to density in Neptune Beach. And like I said, those past examples were just to get you familiar with the idea and how it works and how it can be measured on different properties and what different types of or ranges of density actually look like in real built projects. So this is your future land use map in the current comprehensive plan. It measures, it sets a gross density cap. Both the zoning code and the land development regulations only define gross density and they don't define net density, which is something we may recommend, also having a clear definition as to, how to convert between the two or how to measure, how to figure out on a single family lot what your gross density would be, being that a single lot doesn't have any streets running through it. So that's typically something that gets defined in your comprehensive plan and in your land development regulations. It's a little unclear currently, and certainly something we'll be looking at when we update them. So right now, the vast majority of Neptune Beach is low density residential. That means less than 5 dwelling units to the gross acre. And that's, like I said, this light yellow color, and it covers the vast majority of the land area in Neptune Beach. Then you have a medium density residential, which sets a density cap of 10 dwelling units to the gross acre. And then there's some high density residential in just very few places. That's that kind of dark orange color. And that sets a density cap of 17 dwelling units to the acre.
Louisa, can I break in just for a second? Christina has asked a couple of times, and I think she's relaying a question that she's getting from others about how an acre is defined. Is it according to the geometry? Is it always a square? Is it always a rectangle? No, this is just an amount of area. So for example, if you look in the say northeastern portion of the city, just south of the former Kmart, the lots there are not rectangular, the streets are curvilinear, so you have pie-shaped or keystone-shaped parcels. They still have a land area, and that land area is measured in acres or fractions thereof. And so just to be clear, it isn't something that happens with just rectangles or 90-degree lines, someone was confused about that. It isn't a checkerboard. It's just the total amount of area. Just like your house might take any shape, it could be square or round, but it has a certain number of square feet. Okay, thanks.
Yeah, that's right. So it is the comprehensive plan that sets the actual density maximums that are allowed. And I'll show the zoning map. So this is the city's current zoning map, and it has those same actual density maximums that were set in the comprehensive plan, although it does break out into a couple of more fine-grained areas. But you'll see that R1, R2, and R3 all have the same density maximum of 5 dwelling units to the gross acre. So that complies and responds directly to what's in your future land use map that I just showed. And so here you have R1 through R5, R5 being that high density that we saw on the previous map, with the maximum being 17 dwelling units to the gross acre. Interestingly, the current zoning also defines the central business district, or the CBD, and the central business district actually doesn't specify a density maximum. So that's something we thought is interesting. It looks like residential today is actually permitted, but only by special permit or special exception. It's again, the actual max zoning is not something that is currently set. That's why you see that question mark as to what the maximum allowed is in the central business district. So we were curious to actually see and measure what the actual density is. So the comprehensive plan and the land development regulations set the maximum threshold, so the not to exceed amount. But we actually went through and calculated the number of existing built dwelling units in each of these zoning districts. And so those are the numbers you see on the screen on the map now. So for example, in the neighborhood east of 3rd, that's R4 zoning, the gross density maximum is 10 dwelling units per acre. And what we measured is the actual average gross density. And of course, I say average because we took the total number of homes by the total residential area in that neighborhood, and we got 8 dwelling units to the acre. So all of the actual average gross densities of what's been built in Neptune Beach do comply with the current zoning maximums. So like I said, these are averages. We did want to understand, if this is the average, what's the actual densest parcel in each of these different areas? So of course, some properties will be higher than 8 and some will be lower than 8. This is just showing that the average is 8 dwelling units to the acre. Now, as I mentioned earlier, when you're trying to get the density of an individual building lot or parcel, gross density doesn't really work very well because there is no street running through it. There is no shared amenity space in your individual lot. So that is easier measured as a net density. So this presents a problem because when you're measuring net density, you can't compare that to the gross density that is set in your zoning and your comprehensive plan. So we can't directly compare 33 dwelling units to the acre net, which is the densest parcel we found when we were studying these different zoning districts, with the maximum 10 dwelling units to the acre gross. So how did we fix that? Well, we did a simple calculation, and I apologize at the beginning of this meeting for those who joined us late. That math is always involved when there is a question about density. But essentially, we took the total residential, net residential area in Neptune Beach, which is just the sum of all the residential parcels, and we divided that by the gross residential area, which is all the residential parcels plus all the streets in the residential areas. And that gave us a simple conversion factor of 0.7. And that's just for the analysis of, that's just for the purposes of this analysis, that we can compare the densest net parcel to the actual zoning code. So using that conversion factor, like I mentioned, we took the current zoning, the gross density maximums, and we converted them to net density maximums. This also means that you can go back to the presentation, you can see all the different building types we showed and the examples we showed from all over, and you can see how those would stack up against your zoning, your current zoning measured as net density instead of gross density. So now we can actually compare the densest parcels. And so I'll say, you know, in looking for the densest parcel, we didn't go through every single individual residential property in Neptune Beach. We looked at a couple, and the highest density ones we found are the ones you see here, and I'll actually show the examples of those so you can see them. But just so you can compare, while the average gross density in the neighborhood east of 3rd was 8 dwelling units to the acre, there were and there are properties that go as high as 33 dwelling units to the acre net, which is quite a bit higher than the 10 dwelling units per acre that the R4 would allow. So I'll actually run through these examples so you can understand a little bit better. So in the R2 zone, here's an example of a single family home on a small lot on Acacia. And so this is zoned R2, which after we've converted it is up to 7 dwelling units to the acre net. And this home is about 10 dwelling units to the acre net. And that's simply a result of the fact that it's one home on a 0.1 acre lot. So in the R3 zone, we found this duplex example, you know, which looks like it could be a single family home, but it is indeed a duplex. And there's a lot of these throughout Neptune Beach, many of which are grandfathered in and historic in some way. And this one is 15 dwelling units to the acre net. This is 2 units on 0.13 acres. And so that, and the R3 zoning, after we've converted it to net density, is up to 7 dwelling units to the acre. And so we also looked at the R4 zone, like I mentioned. So here you have a triplex. Again, we know that right now triplexes and fourplexes are no longer considered non-conforming uses in Neptune Beach, but you have a lot of historic homes in the city, and particularly in this neighborhood, where there are still some triplexes and fourplexes. These, just so you see an example, this triplex is actually 33 dwelling units to the acre net. And finally in the R5 zone, where you have some apartments, you also have some townhouses. This is a townhouse on Water's Edge Drive. And so, you know, each of these townhouses actually have slightly different sized lots, but the smallest lot is actually 0.03 acres. And so the townhouse on that small lot is also achieves a density of 33 dwelling units to the acre. And so the actual highest net density we were able to find in studying the different types of residential in Neptune Beach was this one. These are actually 2 individual properties, but each one has actually the highest density, but we just combine them for the purposes of this. It's one fourplex and next to a duplex. And so these are, again, historic examples. This is in the Central Business District, which, like I mentioned, doesn't actually specify a maximum density. It's on combined 0.14 acres and it's 6 units. And so that is a 43 dwelling units to the acre net. That was the highest one we were able to find in our survey of properties. And like I mentioned, we didn't go to every single one. So there's always a possibility that there might be something that's even higher than what we've shown. Okay, now I'm sure there's several questions about this. So I'm happy to take a look at some of the questions we've been getting. Brenda, if you've seen any.
Yes, so we had a question that said, if you're doing net density, then wouldn't you end up with a lot of vacant land over a certain area?
If you were doing net density.
I think the question before that was, how do you define net density? Net density, is it just the land area or lot parcel area or the actual building square square footage?
No. Okay. So net density is just the number of homes or dwelling units divided by the building area. So the parcel, the entire parcel. So if you are on a half-acre lot, your density would be your one home divided by 0.5. So that's how the calculation is done. It's not your building square footage. It's just the number of homes divided by the actual parcel. So gross density includes the streets. And so that's why gross density is a little bit more confusing when you're thinking of an individual property, because individual properties don't have streets running through them and rights of way or easements or anything like that. But when we look at large redevelopment sites, gross density makes a lot more sense because they're actually taking a very large amount of area, and in some cases, many, many parcels that have been aggregated into one, and they're building streets and public spaces, and they're also building buildings. So that's where gross density is most useful.
Another question is, how can there actually be 43 dwelling units an acre in CBD when there are no dwelling units residential allowed there?
So residential is allowed in CBD. And there's a lot of properties in Neptune Beach that are grandfathered in, so they're historic. I mean, this is your current zoning, but it doesn't mean that it's been your zoning code forever. And so there's a lot of residential already in your central business district zone that was there before that was ever called your central business district. And so that's what we mean when we say properties that have been grandfathered in. That doesn't mean you could build it today, but because it was existing when changes occurred, they're still allowed to maintain them.
Yeah, I just want to add too, by special exception as well.
Yes, yes. So if you were to do residential today in the central business district, it's only by special exception.
We have a request to define historic. So some of the examples were labeled as historic structure.
Mm-hmm. Well, historic, we typically mean buildings, to put a very kind of blunt and unrefined definition, is typically buildings that are at least over 50 years old, but that doesn't necessarily mean that the building has historic value. If you really wanted to get more into what constitutes a historic home or what should be preserved as a historic property, you could, communities do undertake a historic resources survey or a historic survey that not only looks at homes of a certain age, but also the architectural character of the homes themselves, and whether there's some special value either because of what happened on a particular site or the architectural style.
So I'm gonna shoot this one to Bill. So we have this one question that says, somebody already answered it, but basically it said, does density account for the lawn around the building?
Yeah,
So,
since density is the number of homes divided by the size of the lot includes the house and the lawn. So yes, the size of the lawn is part of the net acreage that's used to compute density.
mm-hmm. Yep.
I think those are most of the questions we had. We're trying to answer them as they come as well. So we've been trying to answer as many as we can, but I think those are most that are relevant to that topic.
Okay, great. So, congratulations, everyone, for sticking with that. We're not done with the presentation, but at least in terms of explaining and going through the general, 101 of what density is, at least from a community planning perspective and growth management perspective, you have all made it through that part of the presentation. So thanks for sticking with it. So now that, we've gone through exactly what residential density is, roughly how it's calculated, the important distinction between net density and gross density, we want to start thinking about some big questions. What does this all mean for Neptune Beach, and why are we here? So obviously we're updating the comprehensive plan and the land development regulations. And these are also questions we, started to think about and ask through the vision plan process, but, where should the city of Neptune Beach allow mixed use development that includes residential, if anywhere? And what are the types and intensities of residential that are appropriate? And so most of you, it seemed like from the beginning poll, have already been involved. And so that's great. And you may have already talked to us about some of these things, but we definitely wanted to take this opportunity after, presenting in more specific detail what density is and what it actually looks like in the built environment.
Louisa, there's a really a great question here from Michael Kerner about grandfather clauses and the rebuilding after disaster. It could be a natural an event like a weather event, hurricane, or it could be like a fire built. Do you mind taking a second to talk about grandfather clauses? Michael's question was, could a duplex, triplex, or quadruplex, so forth, be rebuilt if it exceeds the zoning density if it was destroyed by natural forces?
That's a good question.
It really depends on how your codes are written. And often zoning codes are written to not allow somebody to rebuild a duplex or a triplex if the current zoning wouldn't allow a new one. But again, that's a local decision that Neptune Beach can decide. Often that kind of policy is really burdensome on landowners and often unnecessary. But it is useful if a particular use shouldn't be in the neighborhood, then you wouldn't want it to be rebuilt. But if it's part of the fabric of the community, you can be more lenient. So a local decision for Neptune Beach to make, and we're happy to help you formulate those alternatives.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I've found that in most communities where we're working on one of these updates to land development regulations, the grandfather clause, that is the thing that determines what you can or can't do after such an event with a property that was non-conforming with whatever the new rules are, that is always tweaked and worked on in these conditions, especially to give consideration to historic preservation or to sync up with other regulations like flood control or FEMA regulations, things like that. So that will undoubtedly be a subject as we get further along in the update of the land development code.
Yep. All right. So like I mentioned, we've already been discussing some of these big questions throughout the vision plan process. And, at our neighborhood workshops, during the design charrette, and during several meetings, we've asked people, what they would like or what they envision for redevelopment along Atlantic Boulevard. And I'm sure you all will hear some of the things you've said, but in this slide. But typically what we found is we've heard a lot of things. We know how important this issue is. And the kinds of responses we've gotten can be broadly kind of categorized into three general groups. The first group is the people who actually like mixed use residential or mixed use development, including residential. And when I say mixed use, what I mean is some combination of retail, office, residential. Doesn't mean you have all three in one building. Sometimes it can also include a hotel and a couple of other things, but that's what we mean. So these are direct quotes. These were written responses we got after we presented the first draft plan in the summer. And so there are people who like the idea of having, second and third floor residential over shops. They think that having the right amount is important, but they really like the idea of mixed use. The second group of people we've heard from are okay with some amount of mixed use that includes residential, but not too much, and certainly no big apartment buildings. And so you can see some of the responses we got and some of the direct quotes that we actually got written responses from. So a lot of people saying, okay, we kind of liked what you drew, but you drew way too many residential units. So maybe just less, or just no apartments of any kind. So that was another group we heard from. And then there's a third group that wants absolutely no residential in any existing commercial area at all. And you can see some examples of people wanting all the commercial areas to stay strictly commercial and the residential areas to stay strictly residential. And so, you know, we really have heard from a wide range of people beginning this process over a year ago. And, you know, we were hoping to get to some clearer consensus or overwhelming consensus as a result of the vision plan process. But we're still not so sure. And that's why we're having this meeting, because at this point in the process, when we're starting to think about how to update the comprehensive plan and land development regulations, we knew it was important to talk specifically about density, what it looks like, what it means, and what the actual existing density is in the community, and how that compares to some different things. So, you know, that's one of the goals of this meeting. And the reason why this is so important, this is a map from the vision plan that we created, is that redevelopment is on the horizon. And I'd say it's more than on the horizon. It's going to happen. It is happening. It has been happening. And so it's important to figure out exactly what you want to allow or don't want to allow on these sites that are likely to be redeveloped. And this map shows different kinds of potential redevelopment sites. In the dark purple are vacant lots, vacant parcels. Those are, you know, the most likely to get redeveloped in the short term. But there's also, in the lighter purple, lots where the improvement to land value ratio is less than 0.5. And so that ratio is a good, quick way to kind of see which parcels are likely to get redeveloped. And improvement to land value just means improvements are any investments that have been made on a particular property. So improvements you've done, that could be a building. You know, if you purchased a parcel that has a building on it, that building has a certain value. Say you invest in repairing it, you build an addition, all of that is considered investment you've made to your property. So if the investment you've made to the property is actually significantly less than the underlying value of the property to begin with, then that property is more likely to be redeveloped. Now, if the improvements and investment somebody has made in a property is higher than the value of the land itself, then that property is not likely to be redeveloped. And so this shows you where that ratio is less than 0.5 and where it's between 0.5 and 1. So this is not a crystal ball. It's not saying we know for sure that these will be redeveloped, but it is likely that eventually in time, some of these larger commercial properties along Atlantic Boulevard will be redeveloped. And as we know, commercial real estate and retail has been changing for many years. What's happening in Neptune Beach is not necessarily unique. We've seen it in lots of communities we worked in where big box shops are closing. This is, of course, accelerated by the pandemic and COVID. The studies now project that between 20,000 and 25,000 there will be between 20 and 25,000 permanent store closures in the US, and that's more than double what there was last year. But I think the important thing to note is that this was already happening prior to the pandemic. And even more important to note is that, disregarding the pandemic for a second, and ever since the Second World War, the United States has overbuilt the amount of retail space. This is actually a really interesting graph for anyone who hasn't seen it. I was really shocked to see it the first time I saw it. This shows the retail space in square feet per capita for different countries in the world as of 2018. So the United States has anywhere from 23.5 to 46 square feet per person. If we just look at the most conservative number, the 23 square feet of retail space per capita, that is double the amount that Australia has. It's 5 times the amount that the United Kingdom has, and it's 10 times the amount that Germany has. So, in addition to things like online retail and Amazon that are also changing the nature of how we shop, the reality is that the US has long been overbuilding the sheer space of retail, and that doesn't include the parking areas that serve that retail. So we were curious to see what that number would be in Neptune Beach. We actually didn't know. So we pulls the property assessment information provided by Duval County, and that's publicly available information. And it gives you the square feet for buildings in different properties. And we looked only at retail buildings. So this doesn't include any fast food commercial places. It doesn't include your banks along 3rd Street or Atlantic. It's just retail. And that includes the area of the now vacant Kmart. So Neptune Beach has 460,000 square feet roughly of retail. That's about 63 square feet per person. So that's very high. It's higher, much higher than the national average, which is already quite high when compared to the rest of the world.
So Louisa, what this is really revealing is the dependence that Neptune Beach has on customers from outside Neptune Beach as part of the larger trade area. And since a lot of that retail space is along the city's border, it's obviously drawing customers from across the border, and Atlantic Beach is drawing customers from outside who are driving distances or on the beach in beaches for some reason and take advantage of the retail offerings that Neptune Beach is providing to the larger metropolis. So that's why this has happened. But this is significant because to the extent that you depend on retail tenants and their customers to sponge up a lot of retail acreage and a lot of retail square footage inside the buildings on that acreage, then you're depending on people to drive from somewhere else in their car, usually one person per vehicle, to your town and clog up your streets, fill up your parking spaces, or compete with you for the parking space or the lane you wanted to drive in. So this is significant because of the number of people who kept mentioning traffic as a reason why they were concerned about future development, overdevelopment, the need for a strong comprehensive plan and codes. And it is a significant issue. But depending on retail customers from a region-sized catchment of customers to come flooding into your town in their cars in order to keep your retail space viable is not the solution to your traffic congestion concerns. In fact, it likely make it worse. The one thing that does happen, however, is that having a lot of retail gives people who live in Neptune Beach more options within short driving distance of their homes, so there's a balance to be struck. But you don't necessarily win the traffic congestion battle by preventing neighbors, but requiring people from other places to drive in with their cars.
Yep, exactly. So we looked at lots of options during the vision plan process for how you might develop specifically the Kmart and the Lucky site. And we kind of combine those into one larger redevelopment area for the purposes of the vision plan process. And there was lots of suggestions from the community, and there were suggestions we explored, and we had to eliminate most of them, partially for the reasons Victor just explained, but there was mention about why not turn it into a public park. That one was quickly eliminated. It's not financially feasible for the city to buy or maintain a park of that size. There's also, well, we could keep it what it is, which is big box retail or strip commercial. Well, like we just mentioned, big box retailers are struggling everywhere. It's less feasible to imagine that a new big box retailer would come up and replace the one that has just gone under. But more importantly, during our workshops, we asked people if they wanted to see more big box retail or strip commercial, and overwhelmingly we heard that that was not something that the community really wanted to see. Now, another option we looked at is a distribution of fulfillment center. We know of a lot of other cities that are seeing their vacant Sears and their vacant big box stores being converted into distribution or fulfillment centers for large online retailers. Now, we quickly eliminated this as well because this is more of a light industrial use. It's not in line with the community's vision. It would lead to more truck traffic and vans coming in and going to distribute all these goods to people. So that was eliminated. Now, we did look more closely at the next two options, one being a walkable retail and office center, which is sometimes known as a lifestyle center. And we also looked at a walkable mixed-use neighborhood that includes residential, but no large apartment buildings. And so So walkable retail and office, while something that a lot of people in the community do like we've mentioned, is not as feasible or really not likely, at least in the short term, given what we know of the retail and commercial market and the office market, I would add. It would require, like Victor just explained, attracting a lot more people from far away to spend money and visit in order to make those businesses viable. And we've heard time and time again that Neptune Beach is a local community and it wants to really serve the people who live in the community or very close by. And so turning these areas into these walkable retail and office centers would mean attracting more and more and more people from outside of your city to support that. And so we put a question mark over the option that we illustrated, which was the walkable mixed-use neighborhood. We got a mixed reception, like I mentioned. Some people really like this idea, others really do not like it. Some are ambivalent, but we don't have any, overwhelming consensus as to what should happen when faced with a large redevelopment site that is today purely commercial. And so I thought, since we've seen all these examples and gone through in much more detail than we ever did during the vision plan, what density is, what it looks like, how it compares with different kinds of places, not only in Florida, but within Neptune Beach itself, that we would look at. So this was that walkable mixed-use neighborhood that we drew, but we never actually showed the density of what we drew. And this felt like a good opportunity to do that. And this really demonstrates two things. One, the gross density of what was illustrated is 9.6 dwelling units to the acre. So that is actually within the threshold of what the comprehensive plan considers medium density. That was the future land use category with the maximum gross density at 10 dwelling units to the acre. And that's also what the zoning currently allows in the R4 zoning district. But the other thing it illustrates that is interesting is that difference between gross and net. So these large redevelopment sites, when you look at them overall, because they're providing public green spaces and adding new streets and parking areas and trees and all these other amenities, they can have low gross densities while still accommodating a variety of different building types with different individual net densities. So what we've illustrated has duplexes that are 20 dwelling units to the acre, has townhouses that are 20 dwelling units to the acre, but it also has bungalow courts that are 28 and 8-unit apartment building that has 40. So even though it can accommodate a range of densities, even though the overall gross density is still medium density. It's still within that, what the comprehensive plan considers to be medium density. So before we ask you some questions to wrap up the meeting, we wanted to just recap everything we've spoken about, because I know we've covered a broad range of different topics. So the first point is that, and the very first point we made, is that density is a very useful growth management tool. And it's useful for the city, regional planning departments, and the state to understand how many people we're expecting in different areas and putting resources in those areas. It's less useful as a community design tool. And that's because, as we've already shown you, developments that look almost identical can have very different densities. And places that look very different can have identical densities. So it's not great at predicting how a particular place is actually going to look. Number two is, when envisioning the character of community, it's actually more useful to understand what building types the community desires, what are the building types you like and where, and then calibrate the density accordingly, rather than vice versa. So for another point is that for large redevelopment sites, gross density is a much more useful measure. Whereas when you're trying to understand density on individual smaller parcels, net density is more appropriate. The kind of fourth key point is that Neptune Beach's small town character is actually the result of an assembly of many different types of buildings that represent a range of densities. This is kind of like the slide I just showed previously, where you can have an average gross density or a gross density on a large site that is very much the medium to low density character. But within that average, you still have a wide range of different net densities of different types of buildings. And it's part of what makes Neptune Beach so interesting and eclectic and unique from the neighboring communities to the north and the south. And then the last point is that even before taking into consideration the impact of the pandemic, Neptune Beach, like most of America, is overzoned for retail uses already. So when we're thinking about what to do with current and future redevelopment sites, it's something to keep in mind. You know, we're not here to tell you, you must allow residential in redevelopment sites. That's not what we're trying to do. We're trying to give you information so that you all as a community can come up with what you think is best and realistic. And that's really all we're here to do. I will make one important note, because this has come up, we've heard it a lot in different meetings, and we felt it warranted clarification. Allowing residential in commercial areas doesn't mean that you're eliminating, reducing, or replacing what's already possible to build there. So just because you allow residential doesn't mean you're not allowing the same amount of commercial that was already permitted in the zoning. One thing doesn't replace the other. In fact, it just increases what's possible to do on any given site. And if you want to guarantee a certain amount of commercial, that's also something you can include in your zoning code in a particular area, or for a particular redevelopment area, for example. Okay, so with that, we're gonna ask some final questions for tonight, at least. I'm sure there will be many other as we continue along through this process. And then we'll have just a little bit of time at the end to answer some additional, any, kind of additional questions maybe we didn't get to, or something that may have occurred to you since you last asked a question. So I'll turn it over to Brenda. If you're just joining us and you haven't done one of these polls, you can take out your cell phone, and the way to participate in the poll is just to text to the number 22333. You text Dover Cole 516 to that number, and you will be entered into the poll.
Okay.
So again, just
good. And the instructions will be at the top of the screen as well. So
yes, exactly.
Again, the number is 22333, and the message is Dover Cole 516. So the first question is, should the city permit any mixed-use development with residential in areas that are currently zoned for commercial use only? So A for yes, B for maybe, and C for no. Wow, that's fluctuating quickly.
The test of how quickly you can text on your phone.
Yeah. All right, so I'm going to give it a couple more seconds, and then I'll go ahead and lock it and move on to the next one. All right. The next one is open-ended, so you're able to share a phrase or a statement of why or why not, why you picked yes, why you picked maybe, and why you picked no.
Yeah, so these are short answers. You guys can type in a sentence, or again, depending how proficient and fast you are at typing on your phone, can do as long as an answer as you want, but we'll start to see the screen populate with lots of different answers.
So here we'll give it a couple of seconds, more seconds than before, so that more people are able to answer, and then we'll start with different types of questions.
And I'm interested, I see somebody wrote, it has to match the community character and quality. And so our presentation tomorrow night, we're doing a special meeting that is specifically focused on form-based codes. And we spoke about that a little bit in last week's meeting, but we're going to delve a little bit in more detail. And the title of the meeting is how to ensure predictable development results. And so we'll talk a little bit more about, I'm okay to allow a duplex. Say you like duplexes or townhouses. I know you all may not, but only if they are nice ones, because of course there's nice versions of every type of building, and some you may not like or not want. And so that's really what we get to control more when we talk about form-based codes, is what the actual architecture and character of the building will end up looking like.
Right. All right, I'm going to give this just a couple more seconds and I'll lock it and move on to the next one. Okay. All right, where should the city allow small lot homes and bungalow courts? Here you can type an answer. So if you want to pick Beaches Town Center, you can send that as a separate answer. And then if you also believe it should be in, like, for example, in select residential areas, then you can also like do a multiple answer, but you have to send it one at a time.
Mm-hmm.
So you can text as many as you think.
And again, the examples you see, the pictures, those are some we had shared earlier. And that's just to give you an idea. And like I mentioned, these building types, a small lot house or a bungalow court, those fall within a certain range of densities, associated densities. So some usually within the 12 to 24 dwelling units to acre net. There's always some exceptions, or the Earl court example is actually higher than that. But again, it all just depends on how small the lot is.
Also keep in mind that these questions, I know we're showing examples, but be a little open-minded about what type of architecture and what type of materials we're using or showing in these examples. What we really mean is what type of use or what type of building structure, not really, we can get into more of like the building architecture and all of that as we move forward within the workshops, but this is more showing you like what type of buildings. All right, I'm gonna lock this one, move on to the next. Here is, where should the city allow duplexes, triplexes, and fourplexes? Again,
Wow.
if there's
That was so
multiple
fast.
answers, yeah, you can go ahead and send them each individually. Okay,
Interesting.
yeah. I'll give this a couple more seconds. Okay, I'm going to lock this one. And here is, where should the city allow townhouses or live-work units?
And we group these together because they tend to be very similar in scale. The main difference is just in a live work that you can, get a small office or a small shop on the ground floor level.
Mm-hmm. And we've also picked these examples that could potentially also fit within the height limitations and all of that that are currently existing in Neptune Beach. Okay, a couple more seconds. Okay, and the last one. Where should the city allow mixed use with residential? Again, text all that apply. There's no diversity here.
Not yet.
Well, there we go. We're starting to get some other ones. Oh, wow, okay.
And we'll note that we showed some examples, like one is a 3-story example, the other one is 2. We're very, cognizant of the height limits and understand that, we're working within that constraint that would, result in either a 2 or 3-story building, more likely a 2-story building. But there is a separate meeting specifically to talk about how we actually measure the height. So there's no discussions of increasing the height, but there is some flexibility potentially in where it's measured. For example, if you're measuring from the base flood elevation or the crown of the road, And then if you're measuring up to the eave of the building or to the highest point of the ridge line of the roof. And so those are some nuances that can really affect what the buildings actually look like. You know, how much diversity of roof types you get and things like that. And also how much you're accommodating, you know, flooding issues and things of that matter.
All right, well, thank you guys for participating in the poll. Oops.
All right, wonderful. So with that, we'll open it up to, some final Q&As and that we'll get to, and I'll go ahead and open the Q&A and see some of the questions we've been getting. While we're reading those, I'm gonna go ahead and leave up on the screen the upcoming meetings so you all can see them. These are just the ones in December. Like I mentioned, we will have a whole set of meetings in January as well, including meetings that talk about how to measure the height of buildings, what architectural standards are and how they can be incorporated into your land development regulations, how to actually establish a new code and what that relationship between the existing code will be. And so lots more to come, but just so you know what's, coming this week. And there's 2 more meetings. There's tomorrow where we'll talk about how to get predictable development outcomes. That'll go into more detail about form-based codes and how you can start to actually put into your land development regulations provisions that will help ensure that new development will look and feel a certain way. And there will also be on Thursday a community resilience planning workshop. So if you're interested in a sea level rise and what that means for your community, I would encourage you to attend. Okay, great. So I'm going to be looking through these. Okay. All right, I don't see a lot of questions, looking for some questions.
We had a question about what about senior facilities on the old Kmart site?
Yeah, it's certainly a possibility to allow senior living. And Bill, correct me if I'm wrong, but that would still, how would senior living be categorized when it comes to residential density?
Well, normally it would just be considered residential, but some communities have special rules. If they want to encourage senior housing, they might allow more units for senior housing, for instance, because there'll often be just one person in a household or only 2 with no children. But that's a local Neptune Beach decision if they want to treat senior housing any differently than any other housing.
Great.
I'm looking for some questions as well.
Yeah. Some people are just sharing thoughts, which is fine. Feel free to share some thoughts as well. We'll have a record of all this. We're just seeing if there's any questions we can answer. Okay. And if any of our panelists have already answered some questions that are worth repeating to the group as a whole, this is also a good time for us to do that. If anyone is interested on the responses that we received to the first draft of the vision plan, those are actually on the website. If you go to the resources page on the NeptuneBeachVisionPlan.com website, there's a resources page, and we've published every single memo, every single public draft, every single presentation, every single recording of a presentation. So that's all available. There is a summary of comments memo. It actually includes everything we heard in response to the draft plan. So if you want to take a look at that, feel free to download it from the website.
Yeah. The only thing I want to add, Louisa, about the senior living Our code defines a family as no more than 4 unrelated persons. So right now that's something that kind of regulates that. Otherwise, we've had questions in the past about group homes and that kind of thing. Those are permitted within our commercial districts currently. But yeah, that's something, that we can evaluate moving forward. As well as the catastrophic event question earlier as well. Within 24 months currently, those can be rebuilt. After that, it has to come into full compliance with the code.
Mm-hmm. So yeah, the difficult thing with non-conforming uses is that what tends to happen over time is there's little incentive for property owners that own a non-conforming building to necessarily keep them nice and up to date or want to remodel them. Usually, if you are going to invest a certain amount in a renovation or an addition of some kind, if you hit a certain threshold, you then have to bring the building into full compliance. So there's less of an incentive to actually maintain those buildings, many of which are historic buildings. So what tends to happen over time is those building types, which are so unique, really just tend to get replaced by single family residential.
What also happens, Louisa, is sometimes an owner of one of those buildings will want to fix it up. And when they go to obtain a bank loan for the renovations, when the bank finds out that the building is non-conforming, meaning it's, let's say, more density than a new building could have, then they really don't want to loan the money for the renovation because they're afraid of, somebody not being able to rebuild that in the case of fire or natural disaster. So often those non-conforming provisions that are all well-intentioned actually often work against historic preservation and against even people who want to improve property just completely at their own expense. It works against it in sort of invisible ways.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and because those properties don't get properly maintained, it's kind of a cyclical thing where they, they draw attention to themselves. And in reality, a lot of those, if well maintained, blend, perfectly with the surrounding area. So, yeah, something to keep in mind. All right. I'm looking through, still getting some comments and thoughts from everyone. Great.
I have an overall observation to make just based on the comments that we've received, the questions that we've received and answered, and the topics that have been coming up, including the many emails and other kinds of feedback that we receive outside of these kinds of sessions. And it's related to what you're going to discuss next week or tomorrow, sorry, in the session about predictable development outcomes. If you wait for developers, that is investors, to speculate on a property, perhaps place an offer on it or buy it, and then go off with their architects and engineers and what have you, and work up their own plan for what should happen on their property. And then if that plan is different from what's allowed under the existing zoning, they'll roll it up and come into City Hall and slide it across the counter and say, we'd like to apply for a change to this. At that point, you're just responding. You're in a community's only option is to be reactive. And as you've experienced, it can be kind of exhausting and expensive to react when a developer on their own comes up with a proposal that you don't like. I think that happened enough times in recent memory that you know what I'm talking about. So it is a really good investment of your time and energy to get out in front of this and use your comprehensive plan, your land development code as the way of doing it, to decide what you want it to be. That's the purpose of putting you through these difficult conversations through the vision plan and even tonight, so that you're being proactive. You make an investment of your time having these kinds of sessions, having these kinds of discussions, even thorny and sensitive ones about controversial topics like building height or density, or blending possible residential uses into commercial properties, or whatever the controversy of the day is. If you do that in advance And then you can be very specific in your land development code and your comprehensive plan about what you're expecting and will approve when the time comes. Then developers will make their best effort to try and figure out something that comes in under those requirements, under that height ceiling, inside that density limit, inside those lot coverage requirements, with whatever you've proposed for parking, less or more, and all those things. They will try to do that. And you will get what you want much more often and with much less of that exhausting sort of zoning battle of the month approach. So that really is as thorny as this gets, and as sensitive as the topics are, and as emotionally wrapped up in it as people understandably get. I just think wanted to say thank you to everybody who's on the Zoom and participating in these, and also sending those emails. Keep those cards and letters coming. It's not a waste of your time. At least I can speak very clearly for the consultants. We read each and every word of every one of those communications, of your responses to the surveys, of your reactions, things that you've typed into the Q&A here tonight, or what have you. So that's just an observation. I hope that's helpful. It does mean that you're going to have to discuss things that normally you'd get to just go discuss in the heated approach that you use to combat bad development at the end. You'd be a lot better off, using the calm community conversation approach in advance, before the developers show up, and welcoming the ones who want what you propose, what you desire. So that's the function of all of this.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you, Louisa.
Yeah, absolutely. And there was something I forgot to mention as well. We know there's been a lot of numbers circulated about how what we illustrated in the vision plan, or how redevelopment generally would affect the overall population of Neptune Beach. And I'm happy for anyone who wants to stay on longer to run through those numbers again. I know it's getting late, so if anyone wants more clarity on what was actually illustrated and what that means in terms of how Neptune Beach's population would actually change, I'm happy to answer an email or get on a phone call with you sometime in the next week to run through that in more detail. I can also stay on later today to go through that, but I know it may be confusing, and there's been some different numbers kind of circulated throughout the community, and that might be confusing, and perhaps there was some miscommunication along the way. So also wanted to make myself and our team available to answer specifically any of those clarification questions. But yeah, we really appreciate you taking the time. I mentioned at the beginning, density is a very tricky topic. Not only is it something we feel emotionally, and that we're so attached to, given the communities we love and the potential of any change, but there are also, like I said, very technical measures and tools that we have to get right when we're writing the regulations and the comprehensive plan. So we feel it both on a kind of visceral and emotional level, but it's also a kind of a very technical tool of community planning that can get a little wonky, and we know can be difficult to understand in some ways. So we appreciate you taking the time. And we still have a little bit more time, so I'll stay on and look through these, see if there's anyone else, any other questions I can answer. Okay.
Louisa, one thing, the questions that have been discussed tonight in the Q&A, in writing or out loud, I know that you're recording the session we're on right now for playback, but how will people access and read through the written questions and answers after tonight?
We get a transcript of those, and we can circulate those on our email list. If I believe all of you are already on it. If you're here, if not, we'll certainly add you. And we can also be posting that, or we'll be posting that along with the recording and the actual PDF of the presentation if anyone wants to look through the slides. That'll all be available on the website tomorrow. Okay. Well, great. I never thought we would get through this before 8 p.m.
I think we're at like 120 questions so far
Yeah.
that have come through the Q&A, some of which have been answered live on the recording, others
Yeah.
in writing as fast as Brenda, Bill, and I, and Christina, and Fred, and other Steph, and they could type answers. So we've had a whole group here working to sift and learn from your comments and questions that you type, that you put in. Sometimes our answers are a little bit quick, so we could, maybe shorter than we'd like if we had more time. So don't worry, we're going to go back over all of these after tonight's session adjourns and make sure there wasn't something in the question or whatever that we didn't catch. So.
There's a question here about, will more options for 500 Atlantic be researched at all, other than the ones we explored through the community vision plan process? So, we're not developers, obviously, and we're not trying to come up with a final development plan for any one particular parcel. What we're trying to do is make sure that the rules will allow good things to happen, and as a corollary, will not allow the things you don't want to happen. So we're in beginning that rule-making phase, and so we could go back and revise what we drew several times. There were suggestions to just, reduce the number of units by this much and increase the retail by this much. And I mean, we could certainly do that, but I guess what's really important is just to know what that max ceiling should be. If you are to allow mixed use with residential, what's the overall gross density that you'd be comfortable with, and you can use existing neighborhoods in Neptune Beach as kind of a comparison when you're thinking about those kinds of questions like we showed tonight, and how that would compare to other parts of Neptune Beach today. And so, we're not looking at designing or thinking about other, very specific or concrete options for 500 Atlantic. But that being said, if you have an idea that you think wasn't thoroughly vetted or explored, that is, greatly different from the ones we had already looked at, by all means, go onto the website. You can contact us there. There's a contact form. You can email Christina at the city. You can email us personally. So, we would love to hear it if there is something that is, quite different from the different options we've looked at. But if it's small tweaks of, a little bit less of this, a little bit more of that, I think at this point we're just hoping to get the character right through what you do in the land development regulations and through something like potentially a form-based code, and make sure that that kind of ceiling of the permissible amount of units per acre is the right one. There's a question about lot coverage and whether lot coverage will be a discussion tomorrow. That's certainly a part of what we could discuss tomorrow. So tomorrow is about form-based code specifically, and kind of the different tools that a form-based code has to get predictable development. And that includes things like lot coverage, but more specifically, we talk about frontage types and windows and build to lines and height and number of stories. And Bill, I don't know if there's anything you would like to add, just, what we were talking about, getting predictable development, different measures involved in that. But
yeah, a big question is what measures should you be regulating? And a lot of codes regulate, let's say, lot coverage, which is how much of a lot can be developed with a building, say 50% or 40% or 60%. And that's sort of an easy regulation for a city to adopt and to enforce. But it's often really not a very good measure in making sure that the new buildings fit your community's vision. So when we talk about predictable development results, you know, we talk about a whole series of measures that could be used and often are used sometimes in place of lot coverage and sometimes along with lot coverage to achieve a particular end.
Mhm.
So lot coverage is, like I say, it's an easy one for cities to apply, but it's not a really good one. I mean, you might think lot coverage means you'll have a lot of green space on a property, but often lot coverage means people pave the rest of the lot with concrete for extra parking or something, and you end up meeting the rule, but not achieving any kind of a vision about green space. So when we talk about predictable development outcomes, we'll talk about the different measures that can be used and try and explain the pros and cons of the different approaches.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so another example, like on a commercial property, you know, lot coverage will tell you what percentage of that property is building area and what percentage is either paved or natural, but it doesn't tell you the placement of the building. So if you want to get places that feel more walkable and more inviting and more active, you want to make sure the buildings are, you know, closer to the street. And so there's other measures and tools you can use to actually get the relationships of the buildings to the sidewalks and the street right. So there's a question here about, could you describe the situation where 500 Atlantic zoning is split, but north of Lemon Street remains commercial and south is rezoned? And so that's a great question. And, you know, you don't have to paint everything the same. So, you know, when we talk about these large redevelopment sites like 500 or 527, or the Kmart and the Lucky site, they're very large areas and they don't have to have the same rules applied throughout the entire property. So rules that might apply for a certain amount of the property facing Atlantic might be very different than the rules that apply facing back into the single family homes that kind of back up onto that site. So we can absolutely be much more fine grained about what you can build where.
Actually, in that scenario that you flashed a picture of, the one that created all the controversy about pages 170 to 183 of the draft vision plan, that reflected a variation on what was described there, where the storefront uses like downstairs retail and restaurants were pushed up closer to Atlantic Boulevard itself. And then behind that layer of mixed use development was all illustrated as residential. And what you're really describing there, I think, is, was it Todd, moving the line between those two further south, which is certainly something that could be explored.
Mm-hmm.
One of the things we've pondered is, despite the significant number of different scenarios that were explored to varying levels of detail, if none of those is okay, then what other scenario that is feasible, economically feasible, is there to explore? And you just described one that might be worth examining, but it's a complete non-starter if you start with the given. And some have stated this position, so I'm not saying I'm for or against it or anything. I'm just saying that some have stated it as a given that any land, any rectangle of land that is zoned commercial now, that within which residential uses are prohibited, should remain just exactly that. Then the scenario that you described would not be, it would be a non-starter. It wouldn't be able to be explored. But I think let's give it some time. Another person typed in about a couple of comments about entertainment uses. Certainly if we go to Myrtle Beach or to Branson, Missouri, they have a lot of commercially zoned property that isn't used in traditional retail senses. It's used for entertainment or entertainment retail, or Grand Ole Opry type large scale entertainment venues, performance halls and things like that. That scale of Branson by the Sea seems like probably a leap. I would expect, based on what we've heard about people's objections to traffic congestion and to an excess number of visitors and so on, would not be welcome. But maybe there's some other entertainment. By entertainment, you mean something else, something smaller scale or lower key, that would be desirable enough on the part of a property owner, potentially lucrative enough in the way that it would operate, to be more attractive to a property owner than just waiting for some future version of storefront retail, or keeping the property fallow for a tax write-off. So these are the, the do nothing scenario might lead to too many of the properties simply being mothballed. And Chuck McHugh provided a long collection, a big collection of compelling photographs of all the graffiti that's starting to accumulate on the vacant commercial properties now. So the mothball scenario, the do nothing scenario, where there is no market for what it's currently zoned, but there is no change in the zoning, is a troubling scenario. And that's why we're putting you through the challenge, really, of looking at all these other options.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thanks for mentioning that, Victor. I forgot to mention that there is an option, like Victor just said, which is the do nothing, although it certainly is troubling in many ways. And we're familiar with many communities that have that problem of, important lot to the town that's remained, vacant for a very long time. And so I think we definitely want to avoid that scenario here in Neptune Beach. Okay, well, we are now right at time. Like I mentioned, all of this will be on the website tomorrow. We'll make sure and get a transcript of these Q&As as well. And we'll be uploading those to the resources page as well as to the events page. And we typically will put the recording and the PDF of the presentation right on the homepage of the website as well, of the most recent meeting. So you can always look there. But thanks again so much for the conversation. We know this is a difficult topic, and it may be one we have to talk about, not just tonight, but on multiple occasions. So we appreciate you being a part of it. And certainly anyone that couldn't attend, please send them the link to the video, put them in contact with us. If they have any specific questions, we're happy to answer them. All right, I don't know if we have anyone else. If Christina, you wanted to say anything before we wrap up, but.
Yeah, I just want to thank everyone. This is so important, especially as we move forward into phases 2 and 3. And so I think the polling was excellent, and kind of really opened up a lot of these conversations on a deeper level. And yeah, but we appreciate everybody's participation and input. And any questions or any other things that you would like for us to answer, feel free. I'm extension 34 at City Hall, and you can also email me at cdd@nbfl.us. Great.
Thank you so much. Thank you to all the council members who have joined us. Thank you, Councilmember Key, Chin. I know that Councilmember Jones was on, and Messenger as well. So thank you all so much for joining us tonight.
Thanks, everyone.
And hopefully we'll see you tomorrow.
Thank you.